Part 4 Bringing People Together. After the Civil War, the United States was as large and varied as of all Western Europe. You could find nearly every kind of landscape, from the alpine heights of the Rockies and Sierras to the tropical Everglades around the Gulf of Mexico. And this variety made the nation more attractive to immigrants from all over. Just as the English could feel at home on the rolling landscape of New England, the Swedes felt less strange on the snowy stretches of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and Italians found similar sunny sea coasts in Southern California. The imported people, the newcomers, spread across the land. From Chicago to New York was as far as from London to Rome, and if you traveled all the way from London to Constantinople and back, you had still not gone quite as far as if you traveled one way from New York to San Francisco. How could these spread out people ever become a single nation? People in the United States wanted and needed new ways to feel closer together. This challenged American know-how, and American know-how, using telegraph wires, rails, and new-style bridges, organized new ways to bind a nation. The nation of many cities remained a nation of many centers. Even before the end of the 1800s, Chicago, St. Louis, and Denver were rivaling Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, the old capitals of the eastern seaboard. And by the mid-1900s, Los Angeles on the Pacific was one of the nation's fastest-growing big cities. Even before the continent began to seem crowded, American know-how, with materials and techniques borrowed from everywhere, sent skyscrapers high in the air. Thousands of people gathered to live and work in a single towering building. In American cities, in the once wilderness of open spaces and fresh air, people packed themselves closer together than ever before. Chapter 18 Everybody Shares the News. Until nearly the time of the Civil War, newspapers were not generally very newsy. They used up much of their space to print stories, poems, essays, and the strong opinions of their owners, and they copied much of their news from other newspapers that arrived by slow mail. Political parties owned or controlled the best-known papers. They praised their own side and slandered the other. If you wanted to know what was happening far outside your neighborhood, you had to wait for a traveler to come by. Businessmen and generals organized their own systems to send urgent messages over great distances. One of the oldest was a semaphore, from the Greek words meaning a signal bearer. People arranged in advance what their signals would mean. Then they built fires, sent up smoke, or arranged a pattern of boards on a high tower. All of these could be seen at a far greater distance than the voice could carry. The Greeks, Romans, and American Indians had all developed lines of semaphore stations to relay messages for many miles. By the mid-1800s, a French semaphore system used 556 separate stations to stretch over 3,000 miles. In the 1840s, a young New England go-getter, Daniel Craig, decided to try sending news by carrier pigeons. He ordered pigeons from Europe and trained them for his Pigeon Express. Soon newspapers subscribed to this service. He would go many miles out into the Atlantic in his boat to meet a ship arriving from Europe. The captain would throw him a watertight canister that contained the latest London newspapers. Then Craig would quickly summarize the news on thin pieces of paper. These he would attach to the legs of his pigeons, and the pigeons then swiftly flew the news to the newspapers. Craig's pigeons went all the way from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to a newspaper in Washington, D.C. The New York Sun even built a dovecote for its own carrier pigeons on the roof of its new building, but the pigeon service proved unreliable, and there was a limit to how much news a pigeon could carry. It was hard to imagine a system that did not depend on seeing signals or on sending written messages, but Samuel F.B. Morse found a way to make an electric current to do its job. Morse was a man of many talents. At Yale, he painted portraits of his fellow students for $5 apiece. Then he went to London, where he studied at the Royal Academy, the honor society of English artists. When Morse came back in 1815, he was a famous artist, but he nearly starved because people would not buy his large paintings. So once again, he made a living by painting portraits. At the age of 30, he went to Italy and France, the headquarters for painting at the time. In 1832, on the sailing ship Sully, as he came back from Europe, a talkative young physician from Boston was among Morse's fellow passengers. Dr. Charles had learned a great deal about electricity while he was in Paris. To while away the 6-week ocean trip, Morse asked him a lot of questions. Morse was an educated man, but he still knew very little about the new science. Would electricity flow through a long wire? How fast did it travel? Why couldn't electricity be used to send messages? Others before Morse had asked the last question and got nowhere with their answers, but Morse did not know enough about the subject to be discouraged. He suddenly decided to make an electric telegraph, from the Greek words for far writer. As an artist, Morse had a bold imagination about shapes of things, and so, right then and there, he began to invent his telegraph. Even today, you can find the shipboard notebook in which Morse wrote his new ideas. It's in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Before he reached New York, Morse had drawn a picture of a telegraph instrument very much like that used today. He had even planned how to use dots and dashes for his new Morse code. "Well," Morse told the captain of the ship as they arrived in New York on November 16, 1832, "should you hear of the telegraph one of these days, remember the discovery was made on board the good ship Sully." It took Morse 5 years to make a telegraph instrument that would work. During that time, he supported himself by giving painting lessons. To build a telegraph line required a small fortune. Most people thought the telegraph was nothing but a toy, a thunder and lightning gimmick. Morse decided to change their minds by a public demonstration. He took his machine with him to Washington, where the Committee on Commerce of the House of Representatives allowed him to demonstrate his telegraph in the Capitol. It was a sensation. "The world is coming to an end," one witness declared. "Time and space are now annihilated." President Martin Van Buren and members of his cabinet came to see the new electric marvel. The chairman of the House Committee, Congressman Fogg Smith of New Hampshire, saw his own chance to make a fortune. When he asked Morse to make him a partner in a firm developing the telegraph, Morse could hardly refuse. For Congressman Smith had the power to persuade the House of Representatives to give Morse the money to build a telegraph line. The congressional debate was hilarious. Opponents jokingly proposed that the money be split among Morse's telegraph and the supporters of hypnotism and the crackpots who believed the world was about to end. Finally, in 1843, 11 years after Morse had his first inspiration, Congress appropriated $30,000. With this money, Morse was supposed to stretch a telegraph line from Baltimore to Washington. At first, Morse and his partners tried burying the wire. They spent $23,000 before they discovered that because the wire was defective, the buried line would not work. They then started all over again by stringing a wire on poles. They were in a hurry to get the job done before the whole Congress began to believe the telegraph was a hoax. Mile after mile, they placed 24-foot-high chestnut poles 200 feet apart. They bored holes in the poles, stuck the necks of old bottles in the holes to serve as insulators, and then threaded the wire through the glass-lined holes. Luckily, at that very moment in May 1844, both of the main political parties were holding their national conventions in Baltimore. This gave Morse his chance to impress all the people in Washington who were especially anxious to learn the names of the candidates. But when the candidates were actually selected, Morse's wire still reached only 22 miles from Washington to Annapolis Junction. To demonstrate his telegraph, Morse had the news brought by train from Baltimore to Annapolis Junction. Then, to beat those who had to carry the news all the way by train, he flashed it over the wire to his telegraph receiving machine in the Capitol. The politicians there were amazed when Morse told them, before anyone else in Washington knew, the names of the Whig Party candidates: Henry Clay for president and Theodore Frelinghuysen for vice president. This was the first news ever flashed by electric telegraph. The telegraph soon impressed people by their sensational uses. When a thief escaped from Washington by train, his description was telegraphed ahead to the station in Baltimore. There he was arrested as he stepped off the train. Newspaper editors predicted that, before long, there would be no more crime since criminals would be too afraid to be struck by the telegraph lightning. Morse joined two newspapermen to form the Magnetic Telegraph Company. They built new lines from Philadelphia to New York, from Philadelphia to Baltimore, and around to all other larger cities. By 1848, the telegraph network reached northward to Portland, Maine, southern to Charleston, and westward to St. Louis, Chicago, and Milwaukee. Regular newspaper columns offered the latest bulletins under the heading, "By Magnetic Telegraph." Newspapermen boasted of the mystic band that now held the nation together. The Mexican-American War, the California Gold Rush, and the national troubles that foreshadowed a civil war, all of these whetted Americans' appetite for news. And the more news people received, the more they wanted. Because it was expensive to gather news by telegraph, the newspapers came together in groups. Since they all shared their latest dispatches, each of them had to pay only a part of the cost of telegraphing the news. In 1848, 6 New York daily newspapers formed the first Associated Press. Their man in Boston took the news brought by ships from Europe and put it in one telegraph to the New York office. Then those group of newspapers, the Associated Press, sold its speedy and reliable dispatches to newspapers in Boston, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. Gathering and selling news became a big business. With the news-gathering experience of the Civil War behind them, go-getting reporters extended the Associated Press throughout the nation. Then every member newspaper supplied its own local news to all the hundreds of other members. Since there were so many members, they could also afford to open offices with full-time reporters all over the world. This increased the quantity and improved the quality of news. The Associated Press stories tried not to be prejudiced or one-sided, for the readers were members of all political parties. Papers would not buy the AP news unless it gave the straight facts. By the early 20th century, there was also a United Press and international news service. At that time, many other new inventions were helping to turn out papers fast and by the millions. In the early 1800s, an ingenious Englishman improved the presses used by big city newspapers. Instead of using a frame that went up and down, he used a cylinder. He had the press attached a blank paper to the cylinder, and then let the cylinder roll it against the type. This was much faster because the cylinder could keep rolling continuously, and the machine could feed a new piece of paper in every time the cylinder went around. Richard Hoe, a young New Yorker, had still a better idea. Why not put the type itself on a cylinder and roll the type smoothly and rapidly against the paper? By 1855, his Hoe rotary press was printing 10,000 newspapers in an hour. The next step was to manufacture paper in long rolls instead of sheets. In 1865, a Philadelphian, William Bullock, made the first machine that printed on a continuous roll of paper and printed both sides of the paper at once. Gadgets that cut and even folded the papers as they came off the press applied the finishing touches. Some metropolitan papers soon put out 6 different editions each day. Newspapers became larger and larger. Sunday newspapers, including advertisements, comics, magazine sections, books, reviews, and everything else, became big enough to fill the whole day for Americans who did not go to church.